Hi, everybody. My name is John. Welcome to the second of two portrait classes. Um, just for those of you that don't know who I am, my name is John Malloy. I am a principal designer and illustrator for Newell Brands, who are owners of all things Prismacolor and Sharpie and Papermate. And I'm also a freelance illustrator and fine artist. I go by the name of Flux. Um, and just if you followed in last class, um, I'm going to just show you really quickly here what we started with. So there was included, and it will be included in the chat if not already, a portrait for reference, and then a template. This is kind of where we landed in the last class, but we did a lot of the face, and then I actually went ahead and finished the face. I'll show that in a minute. And we're going to move on to hair and accessories. So there should be a supply list of like things you could get to use. There's a set of colored pencils that work really well. This shading set, it's highlighting and shading. And I'll go through like what pencils we're using as we go along. And basically, if you want, we would love it if you would hashtag make it with Michaels, tag Prismacolor. You can hashtag or do at Prismacolor. And then if you want to check out more of my stuff, I'm at Flux Artist on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and move on. If you wouldn't mind switching cameras, that's possible. Let's go from there.
Give me just 1 second.
Sure. Thank you.
While we're switching, John, there's people from all over in the class. We have California,
Awesome.
Atlanta, Chicago, New Jersey.
Welcome, everybody. Yeah. I'm excited. I also would love it if after, at the end, if you wanted to share some of your stuff and hold up your work, and we could all take a look at it. That would be awesome just to see where everybody's at. Okay. All right, here we go. So here is the reference photo again, just to show you that basically this is what we were working with and what we're going to work with today. There is kind of where we left off last week, or not last week, a few weeks ago, excuse me, and where we're going to go. So this is a little more in detail. I'm going to hold it up close because I know that a lot of times you can't necessarily see a lot of the detail in these calls. But just so you know, I went ahead and finished the rest of the face using the same technique of shading, basically keeping it all going in one direction, using the same set of pencils, and then moved on to a little bit of the hair, and that's what we're going to do today, and the earring as well. So before I get started, I want to say, this is a way that I do hair. It's very stylized, and there are many ways to do hair. So obviously, this is just one way. If you guys want to break off on a tangent and do your own thing, that's great. Or if you have other ways you'd like to do it, that's awesome too. This is just one way that I think works really well, especially with colored pencils. So the first thing I would do is kind of what I was saying about the face and looking at what colors you're working with and ways to figure that out, is squint. So if you look at this picture, the colors on the screen are gonna be a little bit different, but if you squint and kind of look at the hair, you'll see that it's not really just brown. There's like purples and blues and even some gray and then some brown as well. Depending on your printout, you may see different colors, but those are basically the main colors in the hair. So with colored pencils, it's always best to work from light to dark. So the overall light color here is like a bluish purplish tone. So that's really where I'm going to start. So the one blue pencil in the set, PC 1040, otherwise known as electric blue, is really nice. But before I get going, I'm going to be conscious of like how heavy I put down, how much pressure I put down. So if you go very lightly in the lightest part of the hair and just kind of scrub it a little, it's best to really not have your point be super fine, because that way you can get more of a shaded effect. If you want to do more detail, then that's great to, sharpen your tip more fine, and I'll kind of zoom in so you can see what I'm doing here. All right, so the cool thing about this is that you don't have to worry about really staying within too many detailed lines. You're just shading, but the intent here is to kind of keep it the same level. Like I wouldn't go too dark. Uh, Darker. If you press lighter, it's going to get lighter. But if you can keep it sort of an even tone, that's really a good way to go about it. And just kind of continue down. Um, in this case, I know with the face, I was really saying to try and keep your lines going in the same direction. You don't necessarily have to do that with the hair because we're going to be doing different work with the hair than like we were doing with the face. And just so you guys know, last week I had recommended using a Bristol paper. Bristol Smooth comes in, it works really well. Or if you get something with a tooth, that works well too. This has a little bit of a texture to it. It's just high grade printer paper that I have this on, but it's the kind of paper that you can work on with paint, pencil, or anything like that. And basically just filling it in here with the blue. And the one thing that I should note is that if you look back at this picture and you squint, you can see that most of the blues are really up toward the top portion of the hair. As you get further down the bottom, it becomes more almost golden and brown. But so I'm not going to go all the way to the bottom here. And if you notice, I'm turning my, paper. That's just, if you want to keep going in the same way that you like to shade and you don't want to have to turn your hand awkwardly, it's nice to be able to turn your paper this way.
Hey, John, we got a question on how you decide on your base color.
Yeah, so whatever it is that I'm drawing, if I'm looking at my reference, I kind of, part of this, when you squint to kind of look into it, you sort of see what the lightest color is. Here, the lightest color in these highlights is like a bluish tone. There's a lot of purple, and so purple is made up of blue and red. We're going to get into putting some of that sort of purple tone in later, but the lightest tone really here is blue. So that's what I would suggest. Whatever it is that you're drawing, even if you're drawing from life, kind of see what the lightest color is and start there.
Perfect, thanks.
Sure. All right, so I'm just gonna finish a little bit more of this till it's really filled in. And the thing is, don't worry about being perfect. If you feel like you didn't get all of it or whatever, as you go along, you can always go back with this pencil and put that color in where you feel like it might be more necessary. Right now, I'm just not necessarily even looking at the picture. But when it comes down to it, when you're looking at the picture directly for reference, as you're going along, you're going to be more conscious of what you're putting down. So now we're just sort of filling this in. Okay, so next up, I'm going to go ahead and put in some purple. So we've got some purple tones in the hair. What I'm doing here, like I said, it's stylized. I'm not trying to be super realistic. When you do this, it sort of gives you a little more creative liberty than just trying to duplicate a photograph. I paint very realistically, and sometimes I get to a point I'm like, well, it's why bother? But you have to add some kind of style to it, I feel like, to make it interesting. But when you're doing this, you're not really just copying, you're interpreting it. It's almost as if there's a piece of music that someone interprets through different instruments. Excuse me, you're interpreting a photograph using a different kind of tool. So I'm starting to go in with the purple here and shade with that. And I'm not going in too dark because that I'm going to leave for an outline. So I'm still pretty like light at the top here. And as we get further down the hair, I'm going to probably go a little bit darker just to give some shape to it. And then right here where there's a part in her hair, I'm not really going to color too much in there, just to leave that almost white. All right, so as I'm going down, I'm going to go a little bit darker. And if any of you are familiar with the term ombre or gradient, that's sort of what we're doing here. We're going to get gradually darker as we go down. And one of the things I want to show you is a blending technique that's really fun and doesn't really require you to have a blender. And I don't mean the kind that you blend smoothies in and stuff like that, but you know, an actual colored pencil blender. You can get some that are, it's like a really tightly rolled bundle of paper. It looks like a pencil. That is one you can use, or they actually make colorless blenders. This is actually one that Prismacolor makes. I'm not using it today, but that also comes in handy. But what I'm going to use today is actually just a color pencil. It's sort of how I was taught when I went to school, just because you don't always have a blender handy to work with. So if you use a light color pencil, it works really well. Get a little darker as I go down. And I'll hold this up to the screen in a second so you guys can see just better what I'm doing here. Now, I'm not too concerned about how it looks at the bottom because I'm going to cover this up with brown once we get down there. Right now, we're just working on getting in this blue for the lighter parts of the hair at the top, and purple, rather. So it's also good to be conscious of what kind of surface you're working on. I'm working on a desk, so it's pretty flat. Depending on what you're working on, if you have something that has a texture, it can show up. So actually I have some texture from the wood that's showing up. I'm not that crazy about it, so I'm going to put something underneath as I go on, so I don't have that in the way. It's okay in that area because we're going to just sort of cover that up anyway. But yeah, that's just a good rule of thumb, is to make sure that your surface is pretty smooth that you're working on. If you're working in a pad, it doesn't matter because you've got paper underneath. But if you worked on something like a carpet or some other kind of textured surface, you're going to get that showing through. So that's just a little bit of the purple in there. So now what I'm going to do is take this pencil, which is 914, and I'm going to show you a little bit of the blending technique that I was talking about. Yeah.
Is there a way to pull your camera down a little bit closer, or if you could just show it a couple times so we
Absolutely.
can
I
see a
can
little
get
closer?
a little bit closer.
Thanks.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, great. So with this is the 914. It's kind of a yellowish tone, but if you go ahead and press, you'll see that it, rather than making your color pencil lighter, it actually makes it darker. That's because it's blending the purple and the blue that we just did. So this is one of the things about color pencils that's tricky is, you have to work from light to dark, because if you try to draw with light color pencil on top of dark color pencil, it won't get lighter. It actually does the opposite. Even with white, it tends to get just sort of muddied. But this is a way that we're kind of blending that blue and that purple really nicely using the pencil as a blender. And the cool thing is too, is wherever you've gone darker, you know, it'll still keep that shading. And if you want to go back and even go a little bit darker, you can, and then blend that again. It all depends on what you're working on. Again, in this stage, like this is going to get a little bit covered up, so it's not that big of a deal. But if you have something like a flower, say, and a petal is darker in one area, you can just go back with your darker color and then go back with your blender or whatever it is and shade that in again.
John, we're getting a couple questions about using a blender pencil.
Yeah.
Do you have to clean the blender after every time you use it? And then also, do you just in general know how it works to blend it out, blend out the colors?
Yeah. The pencil, yeah, I mean, it's a good idea to just wipe it off, but it's not that big of a deal. It tends to not really hold too much. So even if you look at this color pencil, essentially a blender is just a color pencil with no color in it. It's just wax. So, you know, you'll just have a little bit on your tip. But this is essentially how you would use it. The same thing. You just basically press much like, you know, with more pressure than the other one when coloring, and that really blends everything together. And that's the same for even the paper ones. You just basically rub those on a side angle to get that. All right, so now we've got some purple and blue in there for the highlights of the hair. And then next, I'm gonna go in with some brown. So as it's going down, we're gonna continue that sort of ombre approach going down. And if you pay attention, you can see like there's these lines in the template. We wanna keep those as intact as possible, at least for now. Um, but you know, test your pressure as you're drawing with the brown and see where it goes. We wanna blend this into the purple. So without covering too much up of those lines on the template underneath, we're going to go over those with some darker pencil in a bit.
Hey, John, when you're done, can you read the number on that pencil again?
Yes, it is 944.
Thanks.
Sorry about that. All right. And I'm going to hold this up so you guys can see much closer what it's looking like. And now that I've been sort of drawing with this pencil for a while, the point is getting less sharp, which allows me to sort of do broader strokes, which is nice because I really just want to fill this in.
John, we just got a question on whether you have to follow the lines of the original drawing.
Well, I would like you to, but obviously, if you want to do your own thing, go for it. Absolutely, that's totally your call. These lines were just taken from the reference file, the reference photo. So, just kind of like to give a hint of where the hair should flow. But obviously, if you want to take your creative liberty, go for it. I'd love to see what you guys do. You know, and that's part of this too. Is yeah, we're doing realism, but you know, everybody's different. Some people like to color outside the line, so to speak, more. And you know, I actually like to do a little bit of both. So that way, you're like I said, you're interpreting what it is you're seeing as opposed to just recreating it verbatim. All right. And I'm just going to finish this part here. See where we land there. And we might come back to this. I just want to move on so we're not stuck doing one thing for the entire class here. Okay. So You notice I just blew on here to get rid of the excess. That's a nice way to do it rather than using your hand, because that will smear your colored pencil. Just a little fun tip. I'm doing a little bit of blending with a lighter color, but not too much. The cool thing is too, is once we actually start putting some outlines on this, the gradient becomes less apparent, almost hidden. And that's actually what I did here. And we're gonna do that down here as well. So now I'm gonna switch to, it's 90% warm gray. It's the number 1058. I believe, I hope Megan, I gave you that number. But that is the one we're gonna use for dark lines rather than black, because black tends to really get muddy, and it can actually just make your colors not look so great. Bear with me while I sharpen it a little bit. All right. So there are these lines down here at the bottom. You can start with those or you can make your own. But basically what you're gonna do is, and this is my style of doing hair, is just draw a line, and as you're going, go in small strokes like this, but with the intent of following one longer line. And you might have to do some more sharpening as you go along. But if you do this sort of small strokes, you can get a nice line that, is smooth and doesn't look so jagged. Rather than if you were to just take your pencil and go, because a lot of times that doesn't work for me. It gets really wonky looking. So this way we're going to get in the texture of the hair just using some lines. And you've already got the color. So it's almost like doing the reverse of a coloring book. You started with the color and now you're going to create the line work. And here's where you can have a little fun with it. I put some suggestive lines at the bottom for the hair, but especially at the top, you can play around with how the hair strands work into each other. So that's like one hair strand, and then you can do one that's in here like this. And as you go along, the hope is that you get more confident with your line. So just by doing these small, sort of easy strokes, it should get easier as you go along. So now I'm going to put another strand in here. Same here. And don't worry about it all being, connected perfectly, because that's sort of the fun thing about doing it this way, is that you can sort of make it up as you go along. Rather than put just another straight strand here, I'm going to do another one like this way, and then in there, like so. And then, this is all sort of where you have a lot more creative liberty to play around. And I'll hold it up close so you guys can see it better. So basically, you're using these lines to create some shape, and then you've got your colors underneath that pop out. And then looking at the way the hair parts here, you'll see there's some detail. And we're just gonna sort of fake that a little bit like this. And there are times when a strand of hair might come down over something. We can also fake that as well. So I stopped here, but if I start another strand up at the top and kind of continue it down like that and connect it with that one, it lets me put some hair underneath. Um, so we're really just kind of, it's almost like illustration, graphic design in a way. We're not being totally representative, but taking a little creative liberty. Okay. So I'm going to just do a few more here and actually start to get into the shading part of it. And if we have time, I'll go back and finish this up. Here, I'm going to actually pull this, start here with this outside piece, and come in like that.
John, we got a question about if you're going to add the skin tone into the hair part.
No, not in this one. Just because there really isn't too much of that in there. I mean, there is a sort of a gold in the bottom part of the hair, but we'll do some yellow and orange, yeah, for sure. But it's not really intentionally to be like a reflection of the skin tone. You might have a photograph, your reference, where you actually have some color from the face reflected in the hair. And then I would say by all means, do that. Okay, so let me do one more here, and then we'll get into the shading part of it. Okay, all right. So now that that's like that, it's nice that we have these lines to sort of create the hair, but they don't really give it too much dimension. So what we're going to do, and this is, I personally am a big fan of Alphonse Mucha. He did a lot of illustrations of posters and things a long time ago, no longer around, but and he would do it this way where it's sort of graphic but also realistic at the same time. So we're going to fake some of the shadows with using the same darker pencil and just kind of put in some shading right near the edge of the strand. So, and what's cool is if you do that in one area, um, it gives the hair an overall sense of dimension. This is the first time I've ever actually shown somebody how I do this. So it's exciting for me. So, like at the top of the hair, you might have a lot more shadow, like that. If you look there, and then it gets more light as it goes out. So that's what I'm working with here. And if you see other colors and you want to put in other colors, go for it. I'm just sticking with this warm gray, just so I can get the shading part of it in. But obviously, you don't always have to just shade with black or gray. You could shade with your colors too. That might be preferable depending on what you're doing. All right, so got a little bit of shading there. And then the hair has some shadows, here and down toward the right. I'm going to go ahead and put that in there as well. So depending on how much space you have to work with, you might not have enough to put too much shading in there, but at least you can get something that helps give the sense of depth. So in here, where I put in the strands going at a different angle, I'm going to go ahead and give those shadows too. So the shadow, you know, just really rests upon one edge of the strand. It's almost as if, I'll get close up, you're faking that this strand of hair is on top of that one, and that one's on top of that one, and that one's on top of that one, just by putting a little shadow underneath. So now that gives us a little bit of a sense of depth there. And then here, I'm going to go kind of all out, make that pretty dark. And then in this case, for this one, I'm actually just going to put a little shading on the front of the hair because there's really not one on top of it. And then it's as if this one's on top of that one. So if you guys are confused, I'm going to hold it up close. I just put a little bit of a shadow on that strand, and then that way it can carry over to the next one. So there are many different ways to do shading. You know, you can do hatching, cross hatching. This is basically scribbling, you know, and you can do cross scribbling too as well if that's what you like. But essentially, you know, you're kind of going in one direction, or you can go back and forth in both directions to get your shading across. All right, so here now at the bottom, I'm going to go in with some yellow. So this one is 915, and that way I can sort of bring in those gold tones. And, you know, I'm not finishing yet. Obviously, we have more to do down here, but it's nice because we're using some complementary colors. If any of you are familiar with complementary colors, and if you're not, you can just look at a color wheel, just look up a color wheel online. But complementary colors are colors that work really well with each other, and they sit across each other on the color wheel. So purple and yellow are complementary, and they work very nicely together. So now that we've got this yellow hue with the brown, it really pops with the purple at the top. You might feel like her hair looks too purple. And if that's the case, you can go in and sort of work backwards now. Go over with some brown as you're getting toward the top again. So bring some of that up toward the top. Just so it, you know, you might think it blends nicer. I particularly like having the purple at the top, but it's all personal preference. So, and again, we're not painting exactly what we see, we're interpreting what we see, because yes, there are purple hues and things in her hair, but it's not purple. So if you wanted to be more realistic, you could bring more purple tones up into the top. And now you've already got that bluish purple base. So you're not going to ruin any of that. And then even if you want, you can go back and blend this again. So I'm going to use the 914 and just blend some of this brown and purple at the top. Just to get smoother effects, which is nice. And the nice thing about blending is that, you know, if you don't want to have the texture of your paper show up, it pretty much gets rid of that. But you might like the texture. And you could also go back in with, let's say you wanted to add more blue to the hair at the top. You can go in again here and add that as well. All right, so I'm not going to finish the top of the hair. I'm going to actually continue down to the bottom here, um, just to kind of get into the darker areas, because I feel like, we got the lighter part down, and now we can start working on the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and take the brown and finish filling that in. That is the 944, just so y'all know. And just, you don't worry about your tip being too sharp. Um, Chances are if you're pressing hard with a sharp tip, it's going to break anyway. But this way you can get broader strokes in there. Actually, I'm going to leave part of this to have a sort of a lone strand or two. It's by itself.
Hey, John, I just got a question asking if there's a specific blender that you recommend.
I do think that this one is great. The Prismacolor Colorless Blender. It's 1077. So that one is really good. But honestly, any light colored color pencil will do. I do think that personally, I like those better than the paper ones. The paper ones work great for regular pencil, not so much for color pencil. Hopefully that answers.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, cool. All right. So I'm not too concerned, and I apologize for the shakiness here. I'm not too concerned about this being perfect or any kind of detail right now. Just really filling that in. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with creating strands of hair at the bottom. If you do want to in the future, like let's say, you really wanted to get these lighter tones, I would say go ahead and don't press as hard for that. We might actually do a little bit of that over here just so we can show how that's done. But in this case, I'm just doing a full color flood and then really relying on this warm gray to do the shading part of it.
Hey, John, we also got a question asking what makes Prismacolor different? Do you maybe from like an artist designer perspective want to talk about why you like Prismacolor
Oh,
pencils?
sure. Yeah. I really, with colored pencils, I think Prismacolor is the best. I really do. I've been using them for a long time. I actually was using them back in art school. Um, and I think they work really well because they last a long time and they blend really nicely. Or other color pencils don't blend as well. They can get sort of choppy as you're coloring with it. Um, or there's not as nice of a transition between the two colors you're using. Um, and it did just feel good. They feel good to draw with. Um, they don't stop in between. You basically can get a nice continuous line, um, just like I'm doing right now. So I think that's, they've always been something that I've liked because of the quality, um, for those reasons, just because they blend really well and they last a long time. And I think they're nice too because they're both good for beginners and professionals. So depending on what you want to do, you can always use them. You don't have to move on to a different kind or anything like that. You can start with Prismacolor and keep going. All right, so as I'm getting further down the bottom, you'll notice the strands of hair are a little bit wider. And I think that also helps create this depth illusion. you know, that the hair is kind of coming forward or billowing outward a little bit. All right, so I've got that part. And now I'm going to go in and add some of the shading like we did earlier up here. Put some in there. And it's almost as if we're really working with the shadow from this sort of group of hair down to these strands. And then the same here. And you might be asking, like, why did you go down with all brown and then you're doing the black on top or the warm gray on top? The reason being is if we just went in with the warm gray without the brown underneath, it just doesn't look cohesive. And that goes back to my earlier comment about why I like Prismacolor is that they do blend really well. It's almost like they're, you know, you're getting a darker brown by putting this darker color on top. And then I'm going to put in a little bit of shading here to sort of make it look as if the hair is bending more than it is.
John, we're getting a couple of questions on why you choose to use the gray, maybe instead of a darker brown.
Oh, because it's much more graphic. And, you know, if you use the darker brown, it'll give you much more realistic tones. But I think what's nice about this is it gives you that stylized realism that makes the picture pop. And it also, I mean, it's a little more instantly gratifying than if we were to go in and do all those details too. All right. So I've got some shading there. And then I'm going to go in with the yellow again, which is number 915. And color in some of the bottom part of the hair. And then even blend some of this together so that the brown and the warm gray are combined, and the yellow as well. And the nice thing about using warm gray too instead of black, if I were to go over this with the yellow, it actually with black, it would tend to look green. It can just get kind of muddied up. So using a warm gray allows you to blend these much more nicely. So for those of you who don't know what warm means, I just take for granted that most people might know what that means. So there are warm and cool colors on the spectrum, and there are warm and cool versions of all colors on the spectrum. So a warm gray is going to be, if you think of it like more sunny, rich, reddish colors. So it works well with this like reddish brown that I'm using, and golds and oranges. A cool gray is going to be more like if you think winter, bluish, greenish. You know, that's side of the cool end of the spectrum. Um, and like I said, there are warm blues, there are warm greens too, and cool versions of those. But if you think of like fire and ice, that's sort of the best way to describe how those go directionally. All right, so now I'm going to move on to the earring. Just because I know we wanted to do a little bit of this accessory, but before I do, I'm going to hold this up so you guys can see where that went. And, you know, you can always go back and change things if you don't like, you know, it needs a little more brown, needs a little more yellow, that kind of thing to sort of even it out. But that's totally your call. All right. So for the earring, I'm going to hold up the reference closely so you can see. Essentially what we're working with here is blue, yellow, orange, and brown. Um, there might be some other purples and stuff like that in there, but we're doing a graphic interpretation. It doesn't have to look exactly like it. Just, and that's part of where the squinting comes in. We don't really necessarily need to squint because this isn't a big piece, but if you squint, you can really break it down into its basic colors. Um, the other thing about squinting is that if you think about art and the kind of art that you see from far away and you're like, wow, that looks like something, and you get up close and you realize that it's made up of all different shapes and things like that. If you squint when you're looking at things and squint when you're looking at your artwork, you can get that kind of effect. It's much more expressive. Um, all right, so I'm going to move on over there. The first I'm going to start with is that same blue, the 1040. It's almost like this color is like a sapphire. Again, hold that up. And then starting very lightly, but with a pretty fine tip because it's such a small part of this artwork, go in and get some light blue overall. So you'll see there's some light blue in that earring. And then I'm going to hold it up close. Where there are shadows, we're going to start to define those shadows just with that blue. And it's not going to be dark enough, and that's okay. We don't want to go too dark right away. You want to build your shadows. Because if you go in too dark right away, it can look really almost too washed out or too high contrast. Then you lose your detail.
John, we're getting lots of awesome feedback. People are
Oh,
loving
cool.
the class.
Sweet. That's great. I'm excited to see how these things turn out. All right. So now that I've got that blue in there, if I'm going to switch over to the 132, which is like a bluish purple, a cool purple, and go in to the darker parts of the earring. But very gently at first, and then getting darker. It's almost as if you're just very gently shading, and then let's hold this up close. It's so hard to see, but you can see how I've gone in lightly and then went darker toward the edge, and that's how this earring works. This isn't exactly that color, but at least we're close enough. And if you have colors you think work better, then by all means go for it. There's even some greens in here, but we're going to keep it pretty simple just for the earring part.
John, can you hold the reference earring up again?
Sure.
And if you have any tips, I think people are wanting to know how you tell the difference between a shadow and not a shadow within the earring.
Yeah, so if you look at the earring closely, you'll see that there's light parts and dark parts. So all the dark parts are your shadows. The darkest parts, if you have to break it up into 3 tones, your highlights are going to be your lightest part. Your darkest part is your shadow, and then everything else is the mid-tone area. So the way that with colored pencils and pencils, the way that it works is you start with your highlight and work slowly down to your shadow. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm not going right in and putting in that deep shadow yet. I'm waiting until the very end to do that. I actually am an oil painter as well, and the opposite is true for oil paint. So where I work dark and then eventually do the highlights at the very end. But that's a whole other ball game. All right, so I'm gonna hold this up as soon as I get in some dark parts, the shadows. So you guys can see. And then if you want, you can put in some green. This is also in that pack, but it's 920. It's light green. And I'm just gonna put a little bit of that in there. I think this is the one we use in the eyes too. And then for the darkest shadows, I'm gonna go back to that warm gray, sharpen it so I have a fine point. And put it in the darkest parts. So now I've got that. And I might even, just because this is stylized, put a little bit more of an outline on her face to make it pop out. And I'm going to actually put a little bit more blue in here. Because what you don't want to do is, especially when you start putting in black or gray, you don't want to lose your original color, because this is a bright blue earring and we want to keep it that way. All right. So then for the bottom part of the earring, it's gold and orange and yellow, and even a little brown. We're going to start with the lightest color. So that would be the yellow. And for that, I'm going to use the last yellow I use, which is the 915. Bear with me for a second. And just sort of lightly go over that while leaving the top part white. So there's a little white spot. I'm going to leave that white. And then going from the yellow, I'm going to move on to orange, and that is number 921. And then start to shade in the mid-tone areas. There's actually a pretty sharp burst of orange, like right in here. I'm going to leave that there. So keep that in mind when I go in with the brown for the shadows. I don't want to lose that. All right, so, and then go back to the brown, which is number 944. And start to shade that in. A decent point on it. This is one of those cases too, you know, it's working with really fine detail. You want to have a good fine point on your pencil. And then also what I'm doing, just so you're aware, is I'm really converting this into a simpler shape than what it is. You know, if you look at a photograph, a lot of times it puts a lot of blobs in there and sort of different things. I'm just really converting this almost to an oval, to stylize it a little bit, because it not only looks more interesting to me, it's also easier to do. Uh, Gives you a little more creative liberty. All right, so they've got that. The last part I'm going to go in with is the warm gray for the shadow.
John, can you read the color that the ear was again?
The ear is actually a combination. So the ear is, let me see here. It's the same one that I've been using for the blending, 914. And then also I used a little 195, which is pomegranate. The pale vermilion, 921. And I believe those were the three that I used. You can also, you know, for skin tones, if you get a pink, you can use something like that. But in this case, I just really stuck with those three, because it was able to blend. I was able to blend them with this one a little bit. So now that I've got that in there, and we've got a little bit more time, I'm going to do a little bit of the hair underneath. So remember I was saying I'm going to leave some parts open for the lighter areas. I'm going to do that here. So I'll take the brown, which is number 944, lightly shade, unlike before where I really went in with a lot of pressure and made it dark, because I want to leave part of it more lit, or the appearance of light. Okay, and then same thing like I did with the earring. I'm going to shade darker and darker. but I'm not gonna try to go black because I'm going to use the lines like I did in the strands of hair here to fake it. Okay, so you can see I left part of it lit or lighter to work with. And then I'm going to take the pale vermilion, get a little bit of gold orange in there, not too much, just very lightly. I'm going to blend all this together. And then using 915, which is lemon yellow, sharpen it first.
John, do you have a sharpener that you recommend? I've got a couple
I
questions.
do. Yeah, this actually, the one that works really well is an X-Acto. It's an electronic one. I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head, but I'll pull it up on the screen so you guys can see it. It's an electric one. And then sometimes for finer points, I also use just an old school metal sharpener. Both of those work really well. The electric works great for time crunches, and also just for the initial time when you open whenever I open a pack of pencils, I don't usually use them right away like the way that they are. I sharpen them to get longer points on them because it's a lot easier to work with. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and put in some of the strands. So I'm gonna give her face a little bit of an outline. Oh, I lost my tip. Bear with me for a second. I over sharpened. Okay. That's it. Strands like that. I'm going to go in a little bit darker with the brown here. Because I really want that middle part to pop out. And
John,
then,
we've got a couple questions on erasing. If it's
sure.
possible to erase, and if there's an eraser that you recommend.
So with regular color pencils, it's hard. I will be honest. You can use one of these, the Magic Eraser, the Magic Rubber Eraser. That works great. Pearl Pink work as well to an extent. All these work to an extent. Prismacolor does make erasable color pencils, which are much better for that. But they don't necessarily have the same range of colors as the rest of their lines. So it's really tricky, especially once you go in and start putting in darker tones. It becomes a little more difficult. So that's that. I'm going to stop here. So if you guys want to put some of your work up, I'd love to see it. Really quickly change the view so I can see all of them. Oh, those look great. Wow. Natalie Dubkowski, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. That looks beautiful. Wow. Karen Desjardins, hopefully I'm saying that right. Jolie La Rochelle, I think. That looks awesome. It's interesting to see, some people did a different interpretation of this. They took it in a different direction. These all look really good, you guys. So I think that's it. I really appreciate your checking this out. If you want to, you can tag me or obviously tag Prismacolor and make it with Michael's. All right, bye everybody. Take care.